In our last video, we looked at the west side of the 900 block of Military Street. Today we'd like to look at the east side. Currently, the east side looks like this today. Back in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, it looked more like this. And then in the early 1900s and 1800s, it appeared like this here. Been some changes over the years, but for the most part, the original buildings are still on this side of the block. And some of them look very similar to what they looked like back in the 1800s. Of course, none of them have been as nicely restored as the cornerstone of this block, this building right here. But we've already looked at this building in a previous video, so let's go next door and look at this building here. This building here has also been nicely restored, but there's something missing on this building that was there originally. We'll see that in just a minute. Normally I depend upon Google to get the most current pictures I can find since I don't live in Fort Huron anymore, but I was in a town not too long ago and I was able to take a picture of some of these buildings a little closer up, which makes it a little nicer. And today it's occupied by the Gold Rodent Gallery. I'll have to admit that name did bring several images to my mind. I wasn't sure what kind of building this was, what kind of business. But upon further investigation, I realized that it's a coffee shop that kind of combines with an art gallery. And so as you're having your coffee, you can kind of appreciate the art that's hanging up around the store. In the 40s and 50s, this building was occupied by Dave's. I always thought Dave's was a kind of a carryover from the unclaimed freight store that used to be there, but I guess not. I think it was mainly auto accessories and hardware and things along those lines. As I said, the unclaimed freight store previously was in this building before Dave's. Unclaimed freight store might have been a little bit of misadvertisement. I don't really know of any freight that would be unclaimed. But I think it was mainly for overstocks, different companies, and they would move them through these unclaimed freight stores. That's just my opinion. I told you earlier that there was something missing from the current building that used to be on this building, and that's right here. The very top part of it was more ornamental at one time. And you can see a little better picture of it in this one right here. In the 1920s, it was a shoe store. It was the Tuttle Scott shoe store. And previous to that, in 1919, and a little before that even, it was a J.C. Penney store, probably their first location. And here's the picture of the inside of it at that time, along with the staff. Before that, in the early 1900s and 1800s, it was the Boston store. The Boston store was a dry goods store. And I've talked about dry goods stores like Miso and some of my other videos, and perhaps you're not familiar with the dry goods store, so maybe I should explain that to you. It's not the same as what a general store was. A general store carried a little bit of everything, including groceries and hardware. Whereas a dry goods store was basically, they sold fabric, thread, ribbon, needles, sewing supplies, and then as pre-made clothes came out, they dry goods stores started selling clothing and became clothing stores or evolved into department stores. This picture here also gives you a good view of the top of that building. You can see it perhaps a little more clearly than you could in the other one. As the dry goods stores made the transition from fabric to pre-made clothes, here's an example in this ad of the type of things that they carried. I don't know about you, but pantaloon to me always, I assumed was this right here. But that's not what it is. Actually, it's men's trousers, very tight men's trousers, like these shown right here. And I wonder the same thing I wonder about ladies' jeans I see today on women. How in the world did they get into them? Yeah, how did men get into these? I guess I'll never know. At some time during the early 1900s, there was an arcade here. Now, it could have been on the second floor or the first, we don't really know. And we don't know for sure what this arcade consisted of. All we know for certain is that it wasn't a video arcade. In the 1800s, this building was occupied by B.C. Farron, who was a shoe merchant, and he also sold pianos and organs. Not two things you would look for in the same store, but he was probably proficient in both of them, and being the entrepreneur that he was, that's what he sold. And yes, I think that really is his real nose. And this is what his store looked like. In this brochure from 1897, this is what it has to say about the store and Mr. Farron. B.C. Farron has been in the boot and shoe business since 1890. He has been more than successful in one of the best stores in the Thumb. He handles pianos and organs and all the most prominent makes. He was born in Port Huron in 1859 and is one of the city's most agreeable and courteous businessmen. His extensive business is not confined to the city alone, but extends over the adjacent country. His untiring efforts to please and give satisfaction in every way, and his confidence in judicious advertising accounts in a measure for his business. He can fit you with anything in the line of shoes, and of any quality or style. I thought it might be interesting to see a side-by-side comparison, the 1800 version versus the 2013 version. Alright, let's move on to our next business. This building here is being occupied by Elite Feet Shoe Store, which specializes in running and walking shoes. This building has always fascinated me, mainly because of the three circles at the top of the building. For the longest time I thought these were windows, mainly because of pictures like this here. In this picture, it appears to be windows. It has the eyebrows over it and everything, which most windows did, or a lot of them did. But I think because of the inset and that second layer of brick setting back, it appeared to be windows. Also notice that roof line is straight across, also straight across today as well. But in the earlier picture, in a minute, you'll see that there was something else there on top. From the 1920s all the way up into the 60s and perhaps even into 70s, this building was occupied by the Howard Furniture Company. And eventually they took over the next building as well. In this photo here, it gives you a little better look at the top of both the windows and the very top part of the building. You can see it has quite an overhang here that's decorative, not a real clear picture of it. And also you get the first inkling of what those three round circles look like, and it's a little bit clearer in this picture here as we zoom in. Here you can see it's not windows at all, but it's decorative circles. As you compare the building of the 1800s to today's building, you can see that basically the only thing missing here are the two inner circles. I think it looks like at that time it was also contrasting colors, whereas today it's all the same color brick. And as we continue to the building just south, we find that it's occupied by Weekend Gift Shop. And this building isn't real distinctive in its architectural design, but like most of the older buildings back then, it always had some type of design. And you can see on the left these blocks going up the side, which gives it a little bit more pizzazz, and the scallop design that goes across the top. And then of course the eyebrows over the window. Like so many buildings, we just don't notice these things as we just glance at the buildings as we go past. And some of these buildings are quite interesting if we just take the time to look at them. As I said earlier, Howard Furniture took over this building in addition to the one just north of it to enlarge their space. And it was there most of the lifetime of the building. In the late 1800s, early 1900s, the building was occupied by Assman and Beard Company. This was a drapery company and curtains. That was their mainstay. They sold some dry goods as well. Then about 1904, George Lutz bought out the company and made his own company. George Lutz used to run the drapery department at Miso Dry Goods Store, and so we had quite a bit of experience as well. And then, of course, Howard Furniture took over. As we continue southward, we come to this building here, which is now occupied by Centec, which is a placement agency for skilled and professional workers. If you look at the architecture of this building, you'll see that because of the contrasting colors, it stands out quite clearly. And again, you have the eyebrows over the windows, and they have the scalloping a little bit different than the building just before it, but quite prominent with the two-tone coloring. And of course, the awnings add a nice little touch. For most of the life of this building, it was occupied by Jacoby Clothing Company, which was a menswear clothing store. And it was there for a long time. It was there in the 1950s all the way back into the 1880s. And here's an ad from that time period. Notice that the address is 17 Military Street, and it's just opposite the City Opera House. Well, of course, on the side of the street opposite the City Opera House would be even numbers today. And for many years it was even numbers, but back in that period of time it must not have been. Also, sometimes even later on, first part of the 1900s and later, sometimes if one building would be occupied, or two buildings occupied by the same company, they'd change the addresses to make it just one address, and later on they change it back to two. For example, Jacoby was actually at 914 Military Street, but you also see that Lux was also at 914, and they were in the building just north. So that was changed over the years too. So sometimes it's a little bit of a puzzle to figure out where every business was. In the 1960s, Gillahan Clothing took over for Jacoby. There's not much in this next building to distinguish it architecturally. Today it's occupied by USA Uniform Company. And by the time that I remember growing up, and all the way up into the 60s, it was Newman Flour Company. Quite a prominent florist at that time in Port Huron. In the 1940s, this building was occupied by the J.A. Vardy Paint and Wallpaper Company. Here you see a sign there advertising the Glidden paint and, of course, the wallpaper. And down here we have a family on the automobile just watching the parade. Of course, you can't park there anymore during the parade. But those were the days. In our next video, we'll finish up this block, and if we have time, we'll get into the next block and see what's there.